There are moments in life when we are faced with choices that can change the course of our future forever. My marriage was one such turning point. What once seemed like a perfect union quickly dissolved when my ex-wife decided to leave in pursuit of a wealthier life with another man. Little did she know, the path she chose would lead her down a road of hardship, while I, left with the pieces of our broken family, found a new beginning filled with love, resilience, and ultimately, a happiness I never imagined. This is the story of how our lives took drastically different turns after our divorce. "Gentlemen," Peter began, his voice steady yet filled with a weighty gravity, "if the cheaters knew the kind of karma that awaited them, I'm certain there would be far less infidelity in our lives. So, when a husband uncovers his wife's shocking betrayal, he starts to notice red flags in her behavior. Will he expose the secret affair and seek revenge? Let's dive into this story and find out." Recently, I stumbled upon a video that changed everything. It was filmed at a friend's bachelorette party, where my wife was seen having an exuberant time with two dancers. The footage was secretly recorded by another woman at the party using her smartphone. This woman later shared the video with her boyfriend, a guy I knew from school, though we were never friends. Our paths had crossed a few times, but we never had any real connection. For years, he kept the video under wraps, following the woman's request for secrecy. But after breaking up with her, he started showing the video to his friends, turning it into a laughable anecdote. At parties and gatherings, the footage became a point of amusement, especially among the guys who found it entertaining. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were laughing at me and my wife, though perhaps that was just my own insecurity talking. No one had ever mentioned this video to me or any of my close friends until about a month ago, when one of our mutual friends, while having a drink with that guy, inadvertently spilled the beans. They joked about how his ex-girlfriend had captured a wild scene at a bachelorette party. "You wouldn't believe the antics of those girls," he laughed. But my heart sank when he casually mentioned that one of those girls was my girlfriend at the time, and now my wife. It turned out this guy had trust issues with his girlfriend, which prompted her to film everything to prove her innocence should he ever accuse her of cheating. In her attempt to clear her name, she had sought the support of her friends, unknowingly sealing her own fate. Our mutual friend shared that in that particular situation, all the women, including the one recording, went backstage to the dancer's dressing room. My girlfriend, now my wife, was the only one who seemed to throw caution to the wind. Not only did she engage intimately with one of the dancers, but she was also involved with both of them simultaneously while her friends watched and cheered. About a month ago, after learning all of this, my friend wrestled with whether he should tell me. He hesitated because he knew about my happy marriage and the close bond we shared, especially with our two little daughters, ages 2 and 4. Almost 2 weeks ago, on a Friday evening, he reached out to talk about something important. His serious tone immediately put me on edge. I feared it might be a significant problem he was facing and that he needed someone he could trust. The next day, we met at a local bar. I arrived to find him already there, his demeanor troubled. It was evident he was grappling with something heavy, and I suspected it had more to do with me than with his own troubles. I grew up in a rough neighborhood, and my past is colorful. I'm a big guy who's had my fair share of run-ins with the law. My reputation was tied to my involvement with the local gang, but those days were behind me. For over 8 years, I had turned my life around. I had matured, become less aggressive, and embraced my role as a husband and father. Now, I worked as an electrician in a trade union and maintained a strong friendship with my old buddy. Our friendship had started back in high school, where I always had his back against bullies. Now, at 29, he worked for a corporation, and our social circles had grown apart. As I took a seat at the bar, I could sense his inner turmoil. I met his gaze, feeling anxious, and asked about what was bothering him. He hesitated, warning me that what he was about to reveal could damage my marriage. But he believed honesty was essential, and he felt an obligation to share this information to prevent any future regrets. Finally, with a heavy heart, he disclosed the secret. A couple of weeks ago, During a gathering with friends, one of them had brought up a 5-year-old video. The footage showed my wife in the dressing room with 2 dancers. The news hit me like a ton of bricks. I was flooded with a whirlwind of emotions, anger, confusion, and a deep sense of shame. Part of me wanted to argue with my friend, hoping this was some sort of cruel joke. But deep down, I knew it was the harsh reality I had to face. I vividly recalled that day 5 years ago when my wife suggested attending her friend's bachelorette party. We had been together for about 7 months but hadn't yet moved in together. I had trusted her completely, never imagining that my life would unravel in such a shocking way. Now, confronted with this revelation, I felt a blend of disbelief and betrayal. How could she have done this? What would this mean for our family? My heart raced as I processed the implications. With 2 daughters to care for and a marriage I thought was built on trust, the thought of exposing her infidelity was overwhelming. But now I knew I had to confront the truth, no matter how painful it might be. From a traditional Irish Catholic family, Emily was incredibly beautiful. I loved her deeply, and my first instinct was to protect her honor and reputation. In the past, I might have reacted aggressively to my friend for bringing up such a topic, and maybe that's why he hesitated to tell me earlier, knowing my history with anger. When my friend finally told me about the video, I asked if he had seen it. He said the video was on someone else's phone, but he had only seen part of it. That raised my suspicion, because who only watches part of a video like that? However, at that moment, the details weren't the most pressing thing. I realized my friend wouldn't risk playing such a cruel joke on me, especially when it involved something as serious as my wife's alleged infidelity. He then told me he could get in touch with the person who had the video. I asked for the guy's number, but my friend said he was currently unreachable. However, he promised to keep me updated once he got a response. At first, I wanted to rush home and confront Emily, but my friend advised me to calm down and think things through. I took his advice and stayed at the bar, talking about my relationship with Emily, which had been great up until that point. I never imagined her being involved in something like this. Early on in our relationship, Emily had a wild side, but after that first year together, she seemed to leave her party days behind. Alcohol still sometimes brought out that side of her, but I thought we had moved past it, especially after the birth of our daughter. She had even gone to a bachelorette party a few years back that got out of control, but I figured that was just a one-time slip. When my friend finally received a message from the guy with the video, I immediately got in touch with him. He said he was out of town but would be back next week. I told him I wanted to meet and get a copy of the video on a USB drive. I also asked if he would delete the video from his phone and any other storage. He agreed, but then asked for $1,500 to do it. I wasn't happy about the demand but managed to negotiate it down to $1,100. I didn't think he had any reason to keep the video. My wife and his ex-girlfriend were no longer friends, and it didn't seem like he would gain anything from holding onto it. I was relieved, in a way, because the money gave us an opportunity to create a legal agreement that would prevent him from ever releasing the video. I would be the only one with a copy. I wanted to protect not only Emily, but also my daughter and myself from the shame that would come if the video ever got out. The thought of that video spreading online was a nightmare. I needed to be in control of the situation before confronting Emily. That night, I was too drunk to drive home and had to take a cab, leaving my car at the bar. When I got home, I barely made it through the door. All I remember is calling out to Emily before blacking out. I wanted to confront her that night, but I was too drunk to even speak coherently. The next morning, I woke up on the couch, wrapped in a blanket. Emily had called in sick to work because she was worried about me. She handed me a glass of water and asked me what was wrong. As I looked at her, the memories of the previous night rushed back, and anger overwhelmed me. The images of her with those dancers from the video swirled in my mind, even though I hadn't seen it yet. I could barely speak. Instead, tears started streaming down my face uncontrollably. Emily was confused and tried to comfort me, but I pushed her away. She kept asking what was wrong, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. Finally, I told her that there was a video circulating online, showing her with two men at a bachelorette party 5 years ago. She was taken aback and immediately denied it, insisting the video had to be fake. Despite her protests, I reminded her of a specific party from that time. She admitted she had attended, but firmly denied any infidelity. She claimed the video had to be fabricated. But I couldn't help thinking that maybe she had been too drunk to remember what had happened. Emily asked to see the video for herself, but I told her the person with the video was out of town. Though I wanted to believe her, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Her denial seemed genuine, but I needed to see the video to be sure. The guy had promised to meet me on Tuesday, but it was only Sunday, and I was consumed with anxiety. Thoughts of the video wouldn't leave my mind. Emily's constant checking in on me only heightened my suspicion. Everything felt off. I knew I had to wait, but the more I thought about it, the more restless I became. The video had the potential to destroy everything, and I was stuck in limbo, unsure if my life was already falling apart. A moment that shattered everything. By Monday, I was consumed by anxiety. The whole situation seemed unreal, like I was spiraling into paranoia, questioning whether I was fabricating at all. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I tried to keep calm, offering to send money through Cash App so the video could be uploaded to Dropbox. However, the person on the other end claimed they didn't have enough space. Frustrated, I suggested they create a new account, which they finally did. That evening, I sent $1,100 through the app, and in return, I received a link to the video that would change everything. As I clicked play, my heart raced, fear gripping me. The footage started innocently enough, a group of women, including some of my wife's old friends, cheering on a group of dancers. But what I saw next left me frozen in my seat. My wife, the woman I thought I knew so well, was indecently touching the dancers through their clothes. I couldn't believe it. The video cut to the dressing room, where my wife and two other women were kneeling, assisting the dancers. In the background, there were about 5 men present, standing around as if they were watching some kind of twisted show. My stomach turned. What I saw next was even worse: my wife, fully clothed but engaged in explicit acts with the dancers. Despite the poor quality of the video, there was no mistaking it was her. Her voice was unmistakable, and the actions were all too clear. What broke me wasn't just her actions, but the fact that this intimate moment, something I thought should be private and sacred, was shared so casually with strangers. The dancers seemed aware they were being filmed, but I couldn't tell if my wife and her friends knew. It didn't matter. She wasn't being forced. In fact, she seemed to be the one taking initiative, seeking attention, and engaging willingly. I couldn't reconcile the woman I saw on that screen with the one I fell in love with. When we first met, she seemed reserved, almost shy, and it took months before we had an intimate relationship. I knew she had a bit of a wild side, known as a party girl back then, but I thought that was all in the past. After all, we had 2 children now, and she was a devoted mother, taking care of our family in ways I never thought possible. Yet, here she was, freely participating in acts with strangers, showing no hesitation or shame. The betrayal hit me hard. I always believed that certain moments, certain intimacies, should be shared only between partners. But now, that belief was shattered. My self-esteem crumbled, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't enough for her. I had gained weight recently, sure, but I used to be in great shape. I still considered myself attractive. Despite this, she had chosen to be with someone else. Or worse, multiple people. Had she done this before? The thought ate away at me. When she came home that night, I decided I couldn't stay silent any longer. I turned on the video and played it on the TV, hoping for some sign of remorse or guilt. Instead, she was calm, too calm. She had rehearsed her excuses, as if she'd anticipated this confrontation. She even claimed that at the time of the video, we weren't in an exclusive relationship. My head spun. Was this her justification? I was too stunned to argue, but inside, I was raging. She tried to rationalize her actions, saying we were only friends with benefits back then, as if that made it okay. But we both knew that was a lie. Even if we hadn't officially defined our relationship, we were clearly involved. And no, it wasn't normal to engage in such explicit acts with strangers, especially when one of those strangers was someone she had just met that night. She then shifted the blame, claiming she was drunk and that alcohol made her act out of character. I wasn't buying it. In the video, she was coherent, her speech was clear, and she wasn't stumbling around. There was no moment of hesitation. I knew her well enough to know that she wasn't forced into anything. She was a willing participant. Her continued excuses only deepened my hurt. When I confronted her about the damage this had done to our relationship, she tried to turn it on me, asking if I would judge her based on her past. She insisted that she had accepted me for who I am, flaws and all, so why couldn't I do the same for her? But this wasn't just about her past. It was about what I saw in the present, proof that she had been with others while claiming to be mine. The doubt festered. Had I ever really known her? Or had she always hidden this side of herself from me? The person I thought I married, the devoted wife and mother, was suddenly a stranger. And what hurt the most was that she refused to take responsibility. She tried to deflect, to downplay it, as if it were nothing more than a mistake caused by alcohol. I couldn't stand to be around her. That night, after the confrontation, I slept on the couch. I told myself I was doing it for our kids, not wanting to wake them with my anger. But the truth was, I couldn't bear to share a bed with her. The woman I saw in that video wasn't the woman I had built my life with. I decided to leave home, taking only a few belongings with me, seeking refuge with a colleague to cool off and avoid any impulsive actions that could jeopardize my already delicate situation. After all, I was still on probation, and the last thing I needed was more trouble. I packed up my work clothes, regular clothes, and headed to stay with a single friend who also happened to be a coworker. Despite my wife's persistent calls and texts asking me to return home, I ignored them. I knew I would have to confront the situation sooner or later, but at that moment, the mere thought of seeing her made me furious. Her messages accused me of holding on to old grudges, bringing up how she had forgiven me for spending nearly a year in prison for aggravated assault and enduring 10 years of probation, which limited my opportunities in life. She reminded me how she put herself through college, becoming a physical therapist, while I never pursued higher education. Even so, I still managed to earn a decent living as a union electrician, working during the day and picking up lucrative side jobs in the evenings. Despite our financial stability, it felt like our marriage was unraveling. I began questioning whether I truly knew the woman I had married. When we first got together, I didn't expect perfection. I knew everyone had their secrets. But the more I learned about my wife's past, the more it felt like I had been blindsided. I always thought she was a typical party girl, but when I asked her about previous relationships, she claimed she'd only had 5 boyfriends. That, I later realized, was a lie, especially after what I found out at her bachelorette party. I knew about 3 of her exes, plus 2 short flings, so how many more were there? Even with these doubts, I believed our bond was solid. But now, with this new layer of mistrust, I was left wondering what other secrets she had been keeping from me. It felt like everything in my life was crumbling. I couldn't stay at my friend's place for too long, though. Work obligations were piling up. My house wasn't just our family home, it was also where I stored all my tools and equipment for my electrical projects. I had no choice but to return. 2 days later, I found myself back at the house, more out of necessity than anything else. Divorce or legal separation hadn't crossed my mind yet, I was still trying to process everything. I was emotionally exhausted, deeply depressed, and my appetite had vanished. I desperately needed someone I could trust. That's when I decided to visit my dad. Throughout my life, he'd always been a steady source of guidance, even though I hadn't always listened to him in my younger years. As I got older, I came to value his wisdom more and more. When I explained my situation, he was shocked. He hadn't expected this side of my wife to come to light, though he knew she had her own challenges in life, much like I did. My parents adored my wife, believing she brought out the best in me. They credited her with helping me turn my life around. She had always managed to present herself in the best possible light to my family, which only made everything harder to reconcile. My father, who had been married to my mother for over 36 years, shared some of his thoughts on relationships. He mentioned how different things were in their time, especially without the influence of social media. Nowadays, he said, women, and men, have more opportunities to seek validation from others online. I hadn't considered this before, but it struck a chord. I had already stumbled across my wife's social media accounts, and it made me wonder how much of our relationship was real. My dad encouraged me to go back home, to provide stability for our children and to face my wife with an open mind. He advised that if I approached her without judgment, it might soften her defensiveness and create a path for us to reconcile, assuming she was willing to put in the effort. He also warned me that no relationship is perfect. If my wife was capable of deceiving me, there was no guarantee that someone else wouldn't do the same in the future. Despite this, he understood how difficult forgiveness would be and suggested that if I couldn't move past it, I should start considering other options. After our talk, I felt more determined to return home and confront the situation head-on. The next morning, after dropping our daughter off at school, my wife asked for a private conversation. I could see the tears welling up in her eyes, but I wasn't ready to hear her excuses. I told her we'd talk that evening. Later that night, as I walked into the house, I expected some kind of confession. I thought she would finally admit to cheating or at least owning up to the lies she had told me early in our relationship. When I approached her, she was sitting quietly on the balcony, but something in her demeanor was different. It felt like the image I had of her had completely shattered. The woman I thought I knew no longer existed. And that was just the beginning. I used to think I was the only one burdened with a difficult past, but now I see that everyone knew about my struggles. Despite this, I'm ready to own up to my mistakes. When I got home that day, I found her sitting on the balcony, where we often had our deep talks. It was summer in Massachusetts, and the weather was pleasantly warm, making the balcony the perfect spot to unwind. She greeted me, but I didn't respond. Instead, I went inside, showered, and changed into something more comfortable. When I returned, I had a cold beer in hand, and we sat in peaceful silence. I decided that I would listen to what she had to say, though I suspected her words would be just more tall tales. She likely expected me to start with a barrage of questions, but I held back, letting the tension hang in the air. Finally, she began. She admitted her infidelity, attributing it to a reckless phase in her life. She confessed that, early in our relationship, she wasn't sure we'd last and was still stuck in a lifestyle of wild, irresponsible parties. She expressed regret, insisting that she had been faithful ever since. But I couldn't get past it. How could she have been intimate with men she had just met that same evening? For months, I had been waiting patiently for her to be ready to take that step with me, even though she'd repeatedly said she wasn't ready. Now, she claimed she had wanted our first time together to be special and meaningful, unlike her meaningless encounters with those men. That didn't make sense to me. I told her bluntly, "You didn't hesitate with them on the first night, so why should I wait?" It felt like she had been withholding intimacy as some kind of reward, while shamelessly flaunting herself in front of strangers. I asked if there were other encounters, ones that weren't caught on camera. She swore there weren't, but I remained skeptical. She even offered me her phone and social media passwords to prove she was telling the truth. I doubted her. By now, she'd had enough time to erase anything incriminating from her phone. Even though I didn't expect to find anything, I agreed to check, if only to quiet my racing thoughts. She handed over everything without hesitation, but despite her partial confession, I had a nagging feeling she was still hiding something. That seed of doubt planted itself deep within me, and I found it impossible to trust her. Following my father's advice, I decided to try and repair my marriage. That night, though, I couldn't bring myself to share a bed with her. Instead, I suggested she sleep in the guest room. The next day, I tried to push it all to the back of my mind, but I couldn't resist checking her social media accounts. I knew she must have deleted any evidence, but the intrusive thoughts wouldn't let me focus on anything else. I caved and logged into her accounts, scrolling through her messages. While nothing overtly inappropriate came up, I was surprised by the sheer number of men who had been messaging her, most of them from the Middle East and South Asia, which strangely put me at ease. Yet I noticed she had deleted several of their conversations. It seemed like every time I opened a message, it would mysteriously vanish before I had the chance to read it. A week went by, and things between us remained strained. We talked, but it wasn't the same. She was trying to restore the connection, but I couldn't bring myself to move past what had happened. During one of our conversations, she suggested seeing a marriage counselor, claiming she couldn't handle my distrust any longer. I told her that talking to someone wouldn't magically fix what had been broken. The affair had shattered our marriage, and my constant need to check her social media was draining the life out of me. Despite this, I agreed to give counseling a try. But it wasn't just her betrayal that weighed on me. I started to feel like everyone around me was gossiping about me behind my back. One evening, I went to a bar with some friends. As I sat there, I noticed some acquaintances chatting with the same guy who had sold me the video of her infidelity. A sinking feeling hit me when I saw them glance in my direction, quickly looking away when they realized I had caught them. Their behavior felt mocking, like I was the butt of some cruel joke. At first, I wasn't sure if it was all in my head, but ever since watching that video, I couldn't shake the feeling that everyone was secretly laughing at me. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. I wanted to confront them, call out their childish behavior, but instead, I left the bar and headed home earlier than I had planned. 2 weeks had passed since I found out about everything, and in that time, I hadn't been physically close to my wife. The idea of counseling seemed like a last resort, a thin thread of hope to mend what had been broken. My wife, for her part, seemed genuinely committed to the process. We arranged for a babysitter so we could attend counseling sessions together, trying to work through the damage that had been done. But the wound was still fresh, and her betrayal lingered in every corner of my mind. I entered therapy with a sense of dread, fearing the therapist would put all the blame on me. I had read about him online, hoping his expertise would help us navigate this difficult chapter, but I wasn't sure how things would unfold. The session took a different turn than I expected. The therapist spoke to my wife, Sarah, in a respectful yet direct manner, encouraging her to open up, to be completely truthful. I won't dive into every detail, but the process was intense and complicated. It seemed designed to restore trust between us, though new revelations surfaced during those sessions, revelations that made me question if this was the full extent of her betrayal. I couldn't shake the feeling that there might be more, hidden deeper. The therapist appeared to share my skepticism, which made me feel somewhat validated. He urged us to focus on reconciliation, offering us tools to rebuild trust. But I couldn't fully buy into it, not when Sarah seemed to be holding back, still withholding pieces of the truth. By the third session, something had shifted. Sarah, once open and engaged, began to withdraw. She seemed to feel under attack, defending herself rather than participating fully. I started to see her differently, discovering aspects of her character that had long been hidden. At one point, she even suggested we find another therapist, but I chose not to pursue that. I could sense she wasn't truly committed to the process. She began showing signs that worried me, coming home late, citing a busy work schedule, canceling therapy sessions without telling me. Her actions made it clear she was avoiding accountability. This pattern continued for weeks after I first discovered her betrayal. Eventually, I confided in a close friend, someone who I thought might offer an objective perspective. To my shock, he already knew about what had happened. In fact, most people in our social circle were aware of the affair, and even worse, a video featuring Sarah had been circulating. I was among the last to find out. The weight of this realization crushed me. The thought of strangers, friends, and acquaintances having seen that video left me humiliated. When I confronted Sarah about it, she seemed disturbingly unfazed. Instead of addressing my concerns, she proposed moving away, finding a new job, starting fresh in another town. It was as if she had been planning her escape long before the video came to light. A part of me wondered if she had known about the rumors before I even confronted her, but she never admitted it. In the weeks that followed, I tried reaching out to some of the people who were in the video. Most had moved on or stopped associating with Sarah. Others were still friends with her, though I suspected they were hiding the truth from me. I sent them messages, hoping for some answers, but none responded. As 3 months passed, I found myself caught between anger and desire. There were moments when Sarah would try to seduce me, as if intimacy could somehow heal the wounds. One night, I gave in. But the experience wasn't driven by love or reconciliation, it was fueled by frustration and disappointment. After that night, she moved back into the master bedroom for the first time since the affair had been exposed, but something had shifted inside me. The next evening, she tried to rekindle our connection again, but I couldn't reciprocate. I turned her down, and for the first time in our marriage, I refused intimacy. Sarah was visibly upset, confused even. She offered to do things I had once desired in our relationship, but I couldn't bring myself to be close to her. She tried to hug me, but it felt suffocating. That night, I slept on the couch, unable to bear lying next to her any longer. The following day, she suggested I take up a gym membership, offering me an annual pass, as if physical fitness would somehow fix the emotional rift between us. I declined. My issue wasn't with my physical self, it was the deep emotional chasm that had opened between us, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. Sarah was no longer the person I thought I knew, and I had to come to terms with that. After nearly 4 months of emotional distance, I realized something profound: I needed more. I needed a deeper connection, one that I no longer believed was possible with Sarah. The betrayal had changed everything. I called my father to talk through my thoughts, confessing that I was considering divorce. He offered me advice that I hadn't expected. He suggested a temporary separation, hoping that space might bring clarity. When I returned home that night, I informed Sarah of my decision to move out, at least temporarily. I found a small studio apartment nearby so I could still see our children frequently. Despite her pleas for me to reconsider, my decision was firm. A week later, I signed the lease for the apartment. Moving out felt like stepping into a fog of uncertainty. The idea of living apart from my children weighed heavily on me, and though I wasn't fully committed to divorce yet, I knew I needed space to think clearly. I made sure to keep the keys to the house where my work tools were stored, as if holding onto them would somehow anchor me to the life I was leaving behind. The night before I moved out, we had a heated argument. Sarah was upset, furious even, insisting that she had tried everything to make things right. But deep down, I knew nothing had changed. The emotional wound was too deep. Here's the rewritten and expanded version of the story, keeping the character names but adapted for an American audience with enhanced detail and complexity. From the very start of our separation, Lisa seemed to think my actions were completely irrational. She accused me of overreacting and claimed I was abandoning the family over something that happened before we were even sure we were exclusive. I reminded her that we had talked about this incident more than once, and I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still hiding something from me. I explained to her that I needed space and time to think things through. She then asked, "How long do you expect us to live apart?" After some thought, I suggested a 2-month separation, giving both of us time to figure things out. Most of my belongings were still at the house, but I was determined to find clarity on my own. On the first day after I moved into the small studio apartment I'd rented, A wave of calm washed over me. It felt like a fresh start, but the transition wasn't easy. Lisa was visibly upset with me. She even went so far as to tell our 4-year-old daughter, Emma, that I had abandoned them, which was heartbreaking to hear. The next morning, when I took Emma and her little sister, Olivia, to kindergarten, Emma started crying uncontrollably. I bent down, wiped her tears, and asked, "What's wrong, sweetie?" Through her sobs, she told me that her mom had said I left them. That crushed me. I knelt there in the parking lot, hugging her tightly, assuring her, "No, baby, I haven't left you. I'm still here, taking you to school every day. I'll always be here for you." Later that day, I called Lisa. I was angry and hurt, telling her that involving the kids in our problems was unfair. I reminded her that, even though I wasn't living at home, I was still fulfilling my responsibilities as a father. She dismissed it, saying that in her mind, I had abandoned them. Our conversation went in circles, and I hung up, frustrated. Days passed, and things seemed to settle into a routine. Every morning, I dropped off the girls at kindergarten, and every afternoon I picked them up. After work, I'd spend my evenings at the small apartment, trying to avoid thinking about everything that had happened. I limited my interactions with others because I was still paranoid about people knowing about the video of Lisa. My world felt small, reduced to just my children and my work. Lisa and I spoke regularly, but our conversations were mostly about practical matters, arranging school pickups, groceries, or anything else that concerned the kids. Occasionally, she'd bring me food, and for those brief moments, things felt almost normal. There were no fights or accusations, just an uneasy calm. Despite the tension between us, I felt strangely at peace. It was like a mini vacation from the constant stress of our relationship, and for a while, I even entertained the idea of moving back in once the dust settled. As I was adjusting to life on my own, some friends invited me on a hunting trip to Montana. It was an annual thing they did, heading out to the wilderness for a week to unplug from life. I'd always hesitated in the past, mostly because Lisa had made excuses for why I shouldn't go: too dangerous, too expensive, not enough time, but this time I didn't think twice. I booked my ticket immediately. It felt good to have something to look forward to, something that had nothing to do with the tangled mess of my marriage. But just as I started to embrace this new routine, things took a turn. One day, Lisa called me in a panic. The dishwasher had broken, and she needed me to fix it. I went back to the house and was surprised by what I saw. The living room looked completely different. She had redecorated. New curtains, a sleek sofa, and even some artwork on the walls. I hadn't expected this kind of change so soon. "When did you have time to do all this?" I asked, genuinely puzzled. "I needed a fresh start too," she replied casually. As I worked on fixing the dishwasher, my mind wandered. Was this just a phase for her, or was she truly moving on? After I fixed the appliance, I went upstairs to grab some of my things and noticed something else. Her wardrobe had completely changed. There were new dresses, workout gear, and shoes. I hadn't seen any of it before. She must have been shopping quite a bit. "You've been busy," I remarked. "I've started going to the gym," she said, sounding proud. "I'm working on myself. Trying to get back in shape." I didn't know how to respond. A wave of jealousy surged through me. Was this self-improvement for her, or was she trying to distance herself from our relationship? The more I thought about it, the more I questioned her motives. Weeks passed, and I continued with my daily routine, avoiding deep conversations with Lisa. But one afternoon, she called me again. This time, it was the oven. "Can you come fix it?" she asked. When I arrived, I was hit by yet another wave of changes. The house looked even more different than before, as if she was reinventing her life without me. As I fixed the oven, I couldn't help but wonder if she was happier now that I wasn't around. Afterward, I mentioned her weight loss. "You've slimmed down a lot since I last saw you," I said. "Yeah, I've been really focusing on my health," she replied, almost casually. But there was something in her tone that bothered me. She seemed different, more independent, and less interested in working on our marriage. Then I told her about the upcoming hunting trip. I expected her to protest like she always had, to say it was a waste of money or that it was irresponsible. But this time, she didn't argue. She just nodded and asked, "When are you leaving?" That silence from her told me everything I needed to know. She didn't care if I went. It was as if I was just a handyman to her now, someone to fix things around the house and co-parent the kids. The emotional connection we once had seemed to be slipping away. I realized that Lisa was enjoying a life where she had the best of both worlds, freedom from me but still benefiting from my support, both financial and practical. And as much as I hated to admit it, a part of me wondered if this was the beginning of the end. The conversation with my wife that night was unexpectedly easy, which made me feel a strange sense of relief. As she responded to my questions without resistance, I began to wonder if she had already moved on and no longer cared whether I came back or not. This suspicion gnawed at me, especially when I arrived home a week later. My daughters greeted me with the usual delight, but my eldest daughter asked something that stopped me in my tracks: "Are we going to have a new dad?" Shocked, I reassured her that I wasn't going anywhere. Curious, I asked her why she would ask such a question. She explained that she had seen a man in the house while I was away. At first, I thought she might have confused him with my brother-in-law, Jimmy, who used to live with us. But she knew Jimmy well and was adamant that the man's name was Jacob, a name I had never heard before. Unable to shake the feeling of dread, I spent the entire day trying to figure out who this Jacob was. My wife's behavior had changed ever since we had agreed to work on our relationship, but now I feared the worst. I no longer had access to her social media accounts or messages since she had changed all her passwords after I moved out, which only fueled my suspicions. I began to obsess over this mystery man, wondering if my wife had ever mentioned him before. As I prepared for a weekend hunting trip with friends, I noticed that she no longer seemed interested in reconciling. She wanted me to come back and fix things around the house, but it felt like her heart wasn't in it anymore. That night, after the kids had gone to bed, I decided to visit her unannounced. I had hoped to catch her off guard, but when I arrived, she didn't seem surprised. We spoke politely, but the tension was palpable. I brought up Jacob, asking her why she had been seeing another man while we were supposedly working on fixing our marriage. At first, she brushed it off, claiming Jacob was just a work colleague who had helped her around the house while I was away. But as I pressed her, I could see the anxiety in her eyes. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she admitted that she had slept with him, not once, but twice. She tried to downplay it, saying it didn't mean anything, but I could tell there was more to the story. I continued to push her for answers, asking how long this had been going on. She deflected, blaming me for abandoning her and the kids when I moved out. I raised my voice, demanding the truth. That's when she confessed that her relationship with Jacob had been going on for over a year. Not just physical, but emotional as well. I was stunned. Looking back, I recalled moments during our marriage counseling sessions when the therapist had hinted that my wife might not be as honest as she seemed. At the time, I didn't want to believe it. I had been blind to the truth for so long. Now, it all made sense: the strange behavior, the secrecy, the coldness in our relationship. As I sat there, the weight of the situation hit me like a ton of bricks. My wife had built an entire second life behind my back. The woman I thought I knew, the mother of my children, was not the same person I saw sitting across from me. I asked her one final question: "Do you love him?" She hesitated. The silence in the room was suffocating. Her pause was all the answer I needed. I stood up, tired of the lies and games. I told her that I was filing for divorce and that it was time for us to move on. I told her that while our time together had given us two beautiful daughters, it was clear that our marriage had been built on shaky ground from the start. I couldn't continue pretending that everything was fine, and I was done allowing her to manipulate me. She tried to defend herself, claiming that I had no right to hold her past against her. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the woman I married had never truly been honest with me. I thought about the video I had seen months ago, my wife at a party, intimately involved with strangers. That incident had been the first crack in the foundation of our marriage. Now, with this confession about Jacob, the entire structure had come crumbling down. In the days that followed, I reflected on everything that had happened. I had once believed that we could work through our problems, but now I realized that my wife had never been committed to fixing things. She had been living a lie, and I had been too blind to see it. I called our marriage counselor, thanking her for helping me see the truth, even if it was painful. While she hadn't explicitly told me my wife was being dishonest, she had guided me to discover it on my own. It was a harsh lesson, but one I needed to learn. As I move forward with the divorce, I find myself grateful for the clarity I've gained. It's not easy to accept that the person you thought you knew is someone entirely different, but it's a necessary step in reclaiming my life. My daughters are the most important part of my world now, and they deserve a father who is strong, honest, and unafraid to face the truth, even when it's hard. And as for my wife, I hope she learns from her mistakes. But for me, it's time to let go and begin again. I decided to leave home, taking just a few essentials with me, seeking refuge at a colleague's house. I needed space, time to cool down, and to prevent myself from acting impulsively, especially considering I was already on probation. As I packed my work clothes and personal items, I ignored my wife's constant calls, asking me to return. I knew that at some point I would have to confront the situation, but I was too angry to face her at that moment. Her messages accused me of not being ready to forgive her for past mistakes, bringing up how she had forgiven me for spending nearly a year in prison for aggravated assault, followed by 10 years of probation. That probation held me back in many ways, while she, on the other hand, had gone to college and built a career as a physical therapist. I hadn't pursued higher education, but I was able to make a solid living as an electrician, taking on lucrative side projects in the evenings after union work. Still, it felt like our marriage was falling apart, becoming something that I no longer understood. I once believed I knew who my wife was. When I proposed, I accepted that everyone has a past, but her secrets, ones that kept surfacing over time, started to feel overwhelming. She had told me she'd only had 5 boyfriends before me, but after what I found out during her bachelorette party, that number seemed like a lie. I knew of 3 exes and 2 brief flings. How many more were there? Despite this, I convinced myself we had a strong relationship, but doubt crept in as I wondered what other lies she might be hiding. It felt as though my entire life was unraveling, leaving me confused and unsure of what to believe. I couldn't stay at my friend's house for long, as I had urgent electrical projects and looming deadlines back at home. Our house wasn't just a place we lived, it was also my office and warehouse for all of my equipment. So, despite the emotional turmoil, I had no choice but to return 2 days later. I had to fulfill my responsibilities as a father and stay on track with work obligations. Divorce wasn't on my mind at that moment, even though I was struggling to process everything that had happened. I felt depressed and empty, and all I wanted was someone I could trust. My father had always been my pillar of support, even when I ignored his guidance in my younger years and got myself into trouble. As I matured, I learned to value his advice, so I decided to tell him everything. He was shocked, just like I had been, since he had never fully seen the side of my wife that I was now experiencing. My parents loved her, believing she brought out the best in me and had helped me turn my life around. She had always presented herself favorably to them, as she did with most people, leaving them none the wiser. My father, married to my mother for 36 years, shared his insights on relationships, explaining how different things were in his time compared to now. He pointed out how social media has expanded people's circles, making it easier for women, and men, to seek validation from strangers across the world. I realized the truth of his words, especially after discovering my wife's online activities. But that's a story for another time. My father advised me to go back home and try to maintain a stable presence in my children's lives. He suggested I approach my wife with an open mind, without judgment, to reduce her defensiveness. He said reconciliation could be possible if she was willing to make an effort. However, he also acknowledged that if forgiveness was too hard, I should be prepared to consider other options. His words helped clear my mind, giving me the strength to return home and face the situation head-on. When I got back, I took my daughter to kindergarten, and upon returning, my wife asked if we could talk privately. I told her we could discuss things later that evening. I saw tears welling up in her eyes, but I couldn't bring myself to feel sympathy. She hadn't admitted any guilt yet, and that was what I needed most from her. I received a message from a friend that day, confirming that he had deleted the video that had exposed the truth about her. Even though I couldn't be sure, I had no choice but to take his word for it. That evening, when I arrived home, my wife was already there, sitting on the balcony. I anticipated that she would finally confess to her affair and admit that she had been dishonest, not just in recent months but from the very beginning of our relationship. But as I looked at her, I felt like I didn't recognize the woman I had married. It was as if the image I had of her had completely collapsed. She tried to explain, insisting that her relationship with the man she had been seeing had only turned physical after I left. I found that hard to believe. How could she bring a man into our home, the home we shared with our children, and claim it was something recent? I reminded her that, while we were supposedly working on our marriage, she had chosen to cross that line. Instead of seeking revenge, I told her I was ready to move forward with the divorce, for the sake of our daughters. She accused me of giving up first by leaving home. But I knew in my heart that I had tried, and she had already left our relationship long before I physically walked out the door. Our argument ended, and I was left wondering how we had reached this point. The next day, I made a call to one of her former colleagues, hoping to learn more about the man she had been seeing. My wife had told me his name was Jacob, and that he had worked with her for 2 years. But when I asked the colleague about him, she claimed to know no such person. It only fueled my suspicions that this man was more than just a casual fling. When I confronted my wife about her lies, she finally admitted that Jacob was a wealthy businessman who owned several hotels nearby. She assured me that he was no danger to our family, claiming that their connection had started after the tragic death of his wife. Still, she couldn't explain why she had hidden this from me, or why she had brought him around our daughters without my knowledge. The betrayal I felt was deeper than just infidelity. It was the lies, the deception, and the realization that I no longer knew the woman I had once loved. Although there were moments when I felt a pang of jealousy over Jacob's wealth and success, I understood that I needed to find the truth about everything that had been hidden from me. I had to move forward for my daughter's sake, and perhaps, eventually, for my own peace of mind. 2 months later, our marriage officially ended. After my divorce, we split the profits from selling the house. My ex-wife moved in with her lover, a man who owned several properties, while I relocated to another city, ready to start fresh. With a new, better-paying job, I rented an apartment large enough to accommodate both me and my daughters. I made it my mission to protect them from having to live with someone else's man, keeping their well-being at the forefront of every decision I made. The court's decision to grant me primary custody was a huge relief. My ex-wife was devastated by the ruling, but I was content. More importantly, my daughters had no interest in living with a stranger, especially in the same house. They needed stability, and I was determined to provide that for them. A year later, life took a surprising turn when I married a wonderful woman. She wasn't just beautiful, she was kind, loving, and adored not only me but also my daughters. She stepped into their lives and became the mother figure they had been missing. It was as if she filled the void left by their birth mother, offering them the love and care they deserved. Meanwhile, things weren't going so well for my ex-wife. Not long after our divorce, she was involved in a horrific motorcycle accident that left her permanently disabled. She lost her leg and ended up confined to a wheelchair. As if that wasn't enough, within a month of the accident, her wealthy boyfriend left her. He never proposed, never made good on the life of luxury he promised. In a blink, all the expensive gifts and the lavish lifestyle she had grown accustomed to vanished, leaving her with nothing but memories. She had to sell those gifts just to make ends meet, eventually moving back in with her parents. From time to time, she calls me, her voice heavy with regret, crying about the life we once had together. But the past is just that, the past. It can't be undone, and I've moved on. She chased after wealth, but in the end, found herself not only in poverty but in a wheelchair, feeling abandoned and unwanted. The irony wasn't lost on me. She had left me in search of a life of luxury, only to end up in a far worse situation than she had ever imagined. While I built a new life filled with love and happiness, she was left with nothing but the consequences of her choices. It was a harsh reminder that chasing after material wealth doesn't always lead to true happiness.